Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and as you can see, we've left the confines of the CDB TV studios behind to head south to Plumpton in Penrith in Cumbria to hold round 6 of the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's 2022 Championship. Now, as you can see behind me, we have a nice wide open stubble field park to race our old classic bikes on, so there's plenty of room to get those old vintage race bikes opened up into that top gear. Now, we will have classes from pre-1968 to the pre-1975 class, and also those pre-1989 125s, and to finish we'll have the big bikes of the pre-1984 class. So there's plenty of racing to get through today. Now, weather-wise, forecast is for it to be mainly dry, although we may have a little shower before the end of the day, but hopefully it won't get too wet and spoil our day's racing. So just before we get down to the paddock to have a look at some of the bikes that have turned up to race at this event, I'd like to say a big thank you to Peter Dobinson for his very generous sponsorship of my channel, which is of course enabled me to do the travelling and accommodation expenses for this event, because as you know, this CDB TV YouTube thing, there is a certain dollar value attached to all the travelling and cost for bringing the channel to my YouTubers. So once again, thanks to Peter Dobinson and his friends for helping me out with some very valuable sponsorship. Okay, just before we get down to the racing, let's take a walk around the paddock and have a look at some of those very nice bikes that have turned up to race at this round 6 event here at Penrith. Okay, so let's kick off our round 6 paddock walkabout by taking a look at James Neil Jones's 1979 KX250 Kawasaki. Now, James's bike here isn't, of course, a fully original KX250, as it does have various different non-original parts fitted onto it, but of course you'd expect it to have a few different types of bits and pieces fitted to it after 43 years of racing on the track, because it's not every day that you still see an older twin shock KX still racing these days. But nevertheless, original or not, this is still a very nice looking bike, and the most important thing is that James is still using it as a race machine and not a nice piece of 1970s motocross nostalgia for people just to look at. Now, as I remember, these reed valve two-stroke KX250 motors were quite a decent power plant back in the day, and the bikes also had decent suspension, as I remember, for an old school twin shock racer. But don't forget that all of the bikes that you're going to see in this paddock video, and of course many more, can be seen racing on the track when I post the racing highlights videos, which will be my very next video posting here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. So if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, then please hurry up and do that very small thing, because you don't want to miss out on any of the racing from what turned out to be a fantastic day's racing. And so on the rear of James's KX, we have a nice pair of YSS piggyback rear shocks and Kawasaki's gold coloured rear swing arm there, which certainly was a Kawasaki trademark on these KXs back in 1979. Although I must say it's still great to see one of these older twin shock KXs still taking to the track, and this is certainly not a slow bike, and it's well suited to this kind of open stubble field racing, as you'll soon find out when you see James taking to the track on this bike in the pre-1984 250 class. But certainly another long lost classic. That's James Neil Jones's 1979
KX250. Now, also sitting next to James's Kawasaki was this quite nice looking Honda Red Rocket. Now, I'm just assuming here that this is James's second or possibly even standby race bike to his KX. Another lovely example of one of these iconic Honda Red Rocket machines. Now, I'm sure that you don't need me to tell you all about how influential these iconic Red Rockets were when they were introduced to the motocross world in the late 1970s, but it's probably suffice to say that at that time riders had never really seen anything like these bikes before, and when Honda launched these machines into Europe and the UK at that time, the factory just couldn't keep up with demand, and riders were fast selling on their European Bultacos, Montesos and CZs so that they could finance one of these brand new Japanese Red Rockets. And without doubt, these bikes did have a very good, strong chassis. They had decent suspension also on the front and the rear, and a fantastic two-stroke motor that was both quick and very reliable. And that's another reason that these Red Rockets are still as popular today as they've always been. But I must say, a couple of iconic twin shockers there side by side. That's a 79 KX250 and also a very nice CR250 Honda Red Rocket. Okay, so next up we have a couple of very nice vintage classics from Peter Dobinson, and these are his Cotton and Rickman framed Triumphs. So first up we have the Cotton Triumph, which of course has the now quite rare Cotton chassis with that Triumph twin motor in the frame. Now, the fuel tank back in the day on these bikes would have been made of fiberglass, of course, but it was a bit of a pity that Peter had this bike leaning against his van, as I just couldn't get a good look at the bike's other side. But I'm pretty sure that Peter told me that this was a 1964 machine, and if you're of a certain age, you may remember some of the UK's biggest scrambling racers would more than have likely raced one of these Cottons during those golden days of the 1960s, when our particular sport at that time was called scrambling and not the modern title of motocross. So Peter's next machine is his number one race bike, his 1964 Rickman Triumph, this time of course with a Rickman chassis made famous by the two scrambling brothers of Don and Derek Rickman, who originally designed and built these fantastic frames back in the 1960s. Now, as far as I'm aware, these Rickman chassis are still being produced as a kit with all of the chassis and body parts supplied, and then of course you just have to make up your mind as to which power plant you want to put into the frame, and in Peter's case here it's this fantastic Triumph Twin. Now, I did say to Peter on the day when I saw his bike in the paddock about how nice and shiny all the chrome and bright work was on the bike, and he told me that it was all down to one of Peter's employees at work who was looking for a job on the day. So Peter then just handed him some Solvol Autosol and a rag, and he got him to polish his race bike for this forthcoming event. And I must say, he's made quite a decent job of it as well. But I can certainly vouch for this bike sounding as good as it looks, and once more you'll be able to see Peter riding this Rickman Triumph on the Stubblefield racetrack at Penrith in the forthcoming racing videos. But certainly these Rickman chassis are the staple diet for many riders who race pre-68 or pre-70 race classes, as these bikes are so versatile when it comes to putting either a big single 4-stroke or even a small 2-stroke motor into that Rickman frame. But another quality vintage classic from Peter Dobinson. Now, this was another quite rare bike that I spotted on my travels around the paddock, and this is Steve Halloway's 1979 CR125 Honda. And once again, another rare bike that you very seldom see these days on the racetracks. And although Steve's example here might not be a fully stock original bike, it's certainly another fine example of one of Honda's smaller 2-stroke racers. Now, although for 1979 Honda did say that this was a brand new design of bike for that year, this 125 2-stroke motor was really a bit of a disappointment, and for 1979 it could easily be beaten by the much better RM, YZ and KX 125 bikes. But having said that, I've already seen this bike race on the track, and slow was certainly not the impression I got with Steve in the saddle. But one of the other weird things about these CR125s was that in 1979 they came fitted with a huge 23-inch front wheel and tyre, which nobody could really understand why. But the other factor was that no other tyre manufacturer made a replacement tyre for this model, so riders then simply removed the big wheel and fitted a stock 21-inch wheel and tyre. And once again, I'm pretty sure that these front forks aren't the 79 originals on Steve's bike, which is not surprising really, because the stock front forks on these machines weren't up to much. But you can see that Steve's been out with the spanners and been upgrading some of the dodgy stock parts on his 79 125 for much better quality replacements, which of course is fine, because after all, this is a race bike and it's not a showpiece, and all of these improvements are designed just to make the bike handle and perform better when it's out there on the track. And again, a nice pair of YSS shocks on the back of Steve's Honda to replace what would have been, I think, a pair of Showas back in 1979. But as I said, the bad press that these bikes did receive back in the day was certainly justified at that time, but changing some of those dodgy stock parts and maybe doing a bit of work on the little 125 motor certainly all helped towards making this bike a much more user-friendly experience when it took to the track. And because of that bad reputation these 79s 125s had, is more than likely why you don't see many of them racing in this modern day. Okay, so next up it's Grant Willison's YZ465 Yamaha, and Grant's machine once again is another fine example of what is often described as one of the best YZ motocrossers that Yamaha ever produced. Now, with regards to the bike's year, I'm not entirely sure, but it'll more than likely be a 1980 bike or thereabouts, decked out, of course, in the international yellow and black livery, which was basically done for the USA's benefit, while us Europeans here had to make do with the not so nice white and red models. But these 465 engines were absolute gems of a power plant, and they produced decent amounts of power, although of course the later 490 engines did have the handle of the air hammers due to the sound of the motor pinking or pre-detonation, and they did have a bit of a reputation for being very hard to set up from the factory, but despite that, the bigger 490s weren't short of horsepower when they were working correctly. But I have to say that Grant's 465 certainly looks like a fairly stock bike from that early 1980s era, and maybe apart from a pair of different handlebars that he's bolted onto the bike, it's still a very good example of one of these great YZs from that time. But as I remember, the front and the rear brakes on these bikes were fairly decent, considering that these were still those old school drum brake systems. But at the bike's rear end, of course, we had Yamaha's monocross single shock and swing arm setup, which was again a decent suspension system that worked very well in most race conditions. But yet again, another fine example of an iconic and fantastic race bike. That's Grant Willison's YZ 465 Yamaha. Okay, so next up it's yet another of those Honda Red Rockets, and this time it's the turn of Kevin Robinson's twin shock racer. Now, as you've no doubt guessed, there were quite a few of these 250 Hondas in and around the paddock at this round 6 event at Penrith, and I must say that this bike of Kevin's was an absolute belter. But once more, this bike's more than likely undergone a refurbishment or even a restoration since it was brand new, and apart from it maybe having a replacement fresco expansion chamber and maybe one or two other non-original stock parts fitted, this is still a cracking looking little twin shocker. But there's certainly something about these red rockets with that fire engine red paint on the motor and that red chassis, and it's also said that this compact 250 two-stroke engine only weighed around the 56 pounds mark, which was quite amazing for such a compact, powerful two-stroke motor. And as we move on to the rear of Kevin's Honda, which is sporting a good set of quality YSS rear shocks on the back, which will all be an upgrade on the stock 1970s Honda items. But once more, our Honda Red Rocket is a very good choice of bike if you want to get into twin shock or classic racing, because essentially they're a very good bike, and spare parts and upgrades for these machines are in plentiful supply. But for me, this bike of Kevin's is another cracker, and as I said, maybe not the 100% stock machine that you would have bought back in the day, but with the upgrades that Kevin's bolted onto this machine, it's going to make it into an even better bike than its original 1970s specification. Now, another couple of quite nice bikes that I came across were these two Suzuki RMs belonging to Damien and Jude Crawshaw. Now, unfortunately, I really didn't get much of a chance to get a proper look at both of these bikes because the lads were quite busy beavering away getting the bikes all prepped for racing, but one of them was a 125 while the other was a 250, and again both of these bikes were excellently turned out. Now, this particular bike here was I think the 250, possibly maybe a 1979 or even a 1980 bike, but again maybe not fully original, but as I keep saying, it's very seldom that you'll find a 40-year-old vintage dirt bike with all of its original parts still bolted onto it. But I think it's much more important just to keep these older twin shockers out there on the racetrack where we can all see them in their natural habitat. So next up on our Paddock bikes is Ryan Glendinnings's Honda CR480 twin shocker, and if there were ever a bike that was suitable for this fast, wide open racetrack here at Scratchmere Farm, then this is probably it. A big brute of a bike with this utterly awesome 480 Honda two-stroke motor, a proper open class race bike and super quick on the track, as you'll very soon find out when you watch the racing highlights from this event. But without doubt, these big Hondas are certainly not for the faint-hearted, and certainly not a bike if you're looking to have a leisurely stroll around a field on a Sunday with your dirt bike mates, because these 480s are absolute rocket ships, and they do like to be ridden hard and fast, and your average rider would more than likely only use about half of the power that these bikes develop, and with the right pilot in the driver's seat, there's certainly not many bikes that will pass you once you get these big bore Hondas opened up in top gear. Although having said that, the late great Danny Magoo Chandler was certainly one such rider who could tame one of these 480s and wring its neck on the racetrack, and Danny of course was one of the few human beings who was an absolute master of these legendary 480 Hondas. But still, look out for Ryan doing a fine impression of Danny Magoo Chandler when you see this bike strut its stuff out there on the racetrack. And so from a big bruiser of a two-stroke Honda to another colossal race bike in Jonathan Bethel's big 540 TC four-stroke Husqvarna. But again, another real man's open class twin shocker, and you can also see Jonathan racing this bike in the pre-1984 class when he takes it to the track. But as you'd expect, these big four-banger single-cylinder Husqvarnas are not the lightest of bikes to throw around a racetrack, but when they do get going, they can certainly tramp on, and that's mainly thanks to this absolutely humongous 540 Husqvarna motor, which is not only powerful, but very reliable as well. Now, the motor is a single cylinder, of course, with a twin port cylinder head with twin exhaust pipes that run down either side of the bike. Now, that engine may look bulky and heavy and maybe a bit unwielding, but it's certainly not short of horsepower when it gets going, and when you're chasing this bike from behind, there's certainly no mistaking what make and model of machine that you're following when you see and hear the bark from these big twin tailpipes at the rear of the bike, because they do have a resonance and a brap like no other on the racetrack. Although for me it was a bit strange to see Jonathan riding one of these four-stroke Huskies, as I've always known him to be a CCM rider like his dad was in the past. But again, another great example of one of these big four-banger Husky race machines. Up next we have another British vintage classic, and this time it's Fergus Moody's 1968 Faber B44 BSA. So as you can see, this is an old classic with a Faber frame and that single-cylinder four-stroke B44 BSA engine, and these older vintage race bikes are extremely popular with riders who race in the pre-68 or pre-70s scrambles classes. And this has been a very good race bike for Fergus, who's had this machine now for many years, and It's been very reliable and taken Fergus to quite a few championship wins in the pre-68 over 300cc class, and these big B44 motors are pretty reliable power plants if you keep them well maintained and set up properly. But certainly a bike to consider if you want to try your hand at vintage or even classic scrambling. But they don't come cheap, these bikes, and when they do come up for sale, very good quality examples of these Faber BSAs do fetch decent money, so don't be looking for a cheap and cheerful bargain if you're going to buy one. But once more, this bike of Fergus's is certainly a lovely looking example of one of these pre-68 scrambles bikes, and another machine to look out for when you watch all of the racing highlights, which of course I'll be posting very soon. Now, next up on our Paddock walkabout is David Herdman's CR250 Honda White Rocket, another variation on the Honda Red Rockets that we took a look at earlier in this video. Now, David's bike appears to have the Mugen Honda graphics on the tank and seat, although I'm not entirely sure if this is actually one of those highly tuned exotic Mugen Hondas from way back in the day, because the Mugen versions of these Hondas did have ultra rare, very exotic factory parts fitted onto them that cost an absolute fortune back in the day. But it could quite easily be that David's just added the Mugen graphics to the seat and tank to make it look a little bit more interesting from the run-of-the-mill red rockets that we often come across. But either way, another very nice interpretation of the CR250 Honda red rocket theme. Now, moving right along, we have a quick browse here at John Miller's CR125 Honda Evolution bike. Now, these little 125 two-strokers are becoming very popular with the Scottish Classic Racing Club ever since the club introduced a class for these bikes a couple of years back, and this pre-1989 125 formula is now becoming one of the fastest growing classes in the club at this point. Now, it's said that John had brought this bike along to this round 6 event for a bit of a shakedown ride at Penrith, because John's going to be handing this bike over to another Scottish rider, Mike McClarty, so he can race it at the forthcoming MXDN race event at the world famous Farleigh Castle circuit, which will be next weekend. Now, it looks like John's little 125 has a motor that's been tuned by SCT Racing, which I know absolutely nothing about, but as far as these late 1980 Honda 125 two-stroke motors are concerned, even in their stock standard settings, these are still a very good, compact and powerful little motor. And so as we move on to the back of John's Honda, we have the well-proven Pro Link rear suspension system, and of course a single shock rear end. But as I said, these smaller 125s are certainly becoming very much sought after nowadays for this brand new pre-1989 125 racing class. And when you do get a batch of these different makes and models of CR125s all lined up on the start line, I must say it's a very unique sight and sound. Okay, so we are back once again with another European vintage classic, and this is Peter Maxwell's 1976 AW 400 Maico twin shocker. Now, I'm pretty sure that Peter's old Maico here is still A quite standard bike from 76, although it may have maybe one or two non-original parts bolted onto it. But again, it's still great to see these old AWs from that 1970s era still doing their stuff on the track in these modern times. And I'm sure you already know that these old AW Maicos were made famous by the legendary German motocross racer Adolf Wheel, who was a hugely successful Maico factory rider back in the 70s, who never actually won any international Grand Prix victories, but he still won 14 German motocross championships while he was riding these bikes for the German factory, and that's why they were then given the prefix of AW Maicos in Adolf Wheel's honour of his huge achievements for that German Maico factory. But it's still great to see these old school Maicos still keeping his legacy alive and well through these old race bikes. Now, of course, you can't mention the word Maico without actually showcasing what was possibly their finest bike ever. And this example here is Peter Williamson's 490 Mega 2. Now, I'm pretty sure here that Peter's bike has the legendary 1981 Mega 2 chassis, but it also looks like he's then dropped in a later 490 engine, possibly from a 1982 or even a 1983 bike. But Peter's machine does have some very nice custom made parts in it, including this superbly engineered fuel tank, and I'm also sure that Peter told me that the exhaust expansion chamber was also custom made for this motor and frame. But exactly what you can say about these 490 Maico 2-stroke motors that hasn't already been well documented, because they're just a big brute of an engine, and if you were lucky enough or even brave enough to swing your leg over one of these big Maicos, then you'll already know what a potent weapon they are on any racetrack. And back in the day, I remember I raced a 1980 440 version of one of these Maicos, which wasn't such a great handling machine, it has to be said, but of course in 1981 Maico then got their calculations and sums absolutely spot on and went on to produce what is still regarded as the best twin-shock race bike ever made. But once more, this alloy rear swing arm is yet another of the many custom-made replacement parts on Peter's Maico, along with those Dutch-made Reiger piggyback shocks that are bolted on to the rear. But again, you're never going to come across one of these open class 490s that still have all of their original parts still bolted onto them, which of course is not surprising on a bike that's now coming up for 42 years old. And besides, spare parts and upgrades for these bikes are so easily available and in plentiful supply, which is another reason that makes these 490 Maicos such a fantastic twin-shock race bike for these modern times. But once again, another version of an iconic twin-shock racer. That's Peter Williamson's 490 Maico. Okay, so our final bike from our round 6 paddock walkabout is really a bit of a mystery, as I never really found out who actually owned it, or even if this bike was going to take part in the day's racing. But again, as you can see, it's another lovely example of one of these iconic Honda red rockets, and this featured bike is certainly not a stock example, but is bristling with some very nice upgraded and replacement parts. Now, I'm guessing here once again, but with those Elderfield motorcycles graphics on the bike's plastics, I'll wager that this is a bike from the guys at Elderfield Motorcycles, who specialise in the refurbishment and upgrade of these red rocket bikes. And the Elderfield boys are also a very good contact if you need any engine services or other parts for your precious Honda CR twin shock machines. But that certainly was one of the common factors I noticed as I strolled around the paddock at this round 6 event at Penrith. There certainly wasn't a shortage of these fire engine red Hondas on the day, which again tells you just how good these bikes were back in the 1970s and just how popular they are now here in 2022. And of course the bikes that you've just seen in this video were just a select few that were dotted around the paddock over the course of the morning, and there were many other very nice bikes that were well worthy of a look. It's just that I couldn't gain access to many of them to film them, but just as a heads up for any future race events, if anybody's thinking about going, and if you want your bike featured here on my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel, then surely place it in a position where it's easily accessible and I can work around it, and in that way it's much easier for me to showcase your pride and joy here on my channel. Although anyhow, that's just a very quick look at just a few of the bikes that were scattered around the paddock at Scratchmere Farm for this round 6 event of the Scottish Classic 2022 Championship. So don't forget that you can see all of these bikes and many more in action on the racetrack when I return with part 1 of the racing highlights, which will be my very next video here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.